and the United States were once allies in common cause against the Japanese aggression in the Second World War, and their most famous fighting force was formed by Chinese soldiers and American volunteers, the Flying Tigers of the Chinese Air Force. How should we understand the legacies of the Flying Tigers in time of peace, and what are the lessons for today's relationship? In the first part of the program, I'm happy to be joined by Larry Job, president of the American Flying Tiger Historical Organization. And in the second half, when we come back, I'll be talking to Quan Chima, vice president of the American Flying Tiger Historical Organization, at the invitation of the Chinese People's Association for Friendship with Foreign Countries. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. It's a great honor to have you, Mr. Larry Job, president of American Flying Tiger Historical Organization. Thank you for being with us.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Okay, Larry, you retired from United Airlines in 2001 after 32 years of work as a pilot. But how did you become passionate about the history of the Flying Tigers and decide to found the Flying Tiger Historical Organization?
Well, it happened by accident as much as anything. After I retired from United Airlines, I wanted to tour China, and my wife and I did on a couple of occasions, and then we put a tour together to bring fellow Americans with us, and we did an aviator tour. And in doing that, we brought some Flying Tigers with us, actual Flying Tigers that flew in World War II. And the reception they received from the Chinese people was so grand that I wanted to learn more about what occurred here. So since that time, I have read probably 200 books, and the more you get into the story, the more interesting it becomes. And there are sides that have not been told, both from the American side and the Chinese side, and that's where the real interest deepened.
For example, which part on the American side that the Chinese failed to relate to the young generation regarding the sacrifice and heroic deeds of Flying Tigers?
Well, I think, at least in our country, I can't necessarily speak for your country, but in our country, the Flying Tigers in World War II is ancient history. It is almost the same as when I was a child. The Civil War was so far in the past, little attention was paid to it. And so our younger generation doesn't know. And in this world where our relationships need to be good and need to improve, I think the history of World War II and the cooperation between China and America needs to be focused on.
But each year, I'm afraid, there would always be some important events to commemorate. For example, Pearl Harbor. That was the starting point of the American participation in the Pacific War. And Hiroshima, Nagasaki, where 2 atomic bombs were dropped. 2 cities were leveled to the ground. Do you do anything to commemorate these events so that the younger generation may be inspired?
Well, I think you've hit on a couple of interesting points. First of all, Pearl Harbor was such a significant event in our country that it will probably never be forgotten. As President Roosevelt said, a date which will live in infamy. I think the dropping of the atomic bomb is a very good example of why we need history, of why we need history recorded, because even today we have people trying to rewrite the history and to criticize the dropping of the atomic bomb without any realization of the destruction and death that would have occurred had it been necessary to invade the Japanese homeland.
So what is your position on dropping the atomic bombs? Do you think it's worthwhile?
I think it was the right thing to do.
Because many American lives were saved as a result.
Well, let's recognize not only American lives, but Japanese. Japanese would have fought to the death, civilians as well as the military. So there were millions of lives saved by dropping the bomb. We criticize it today. That's the revisionist history. And that is why we need the history of the time recorded and chronicled, not the history that we would like to write today.
What do you think of the performance of former President Barack Obama in Hiroshima? He attended one of the commemorative activities in Japan to pay tribute to the war dead. Do you think he had drawn criticism from your country, or do you think that's something he should do?
I don't know if he'll draw criticism from my country, but he certainly will from me. And I liked President Obama and do like President Obama. The fact that Japan has failed to apologize for the atrocities that she committed against not just China, but the Asian nations as a whole is reprehensible. I understand through personal experience with Chinese how important face is in Asia. And Japan is remiss in not apologizing. So no, I do not agree with our president attending a memorial service for the Japanese criminals of World War II.
A couple of days ago, dozens of Japanese members of parliament visited Yasukuni Shrine to pay tribute to the war dead, including Class A war criminals.
Correct.
What's your response?
My response is they dishonor themselves, frankly. A strong man can apologize and will apologize. A weak man does not. To honor the criminals of World War II, that is to dishonor oneself.
But it seems every time when Japanese politicians visited Yasukuni Shrine, the U.S. government was very quiet, very, very quiet. Is that because currently you are allies?
You know, I don't really have an answer for that as a U.S. citizen. I'm sure there's many reasons of why the U.S. government was silent. Does that mean as a citizen we approve of that silence? No. And also, let me add, I only understand the importance of face to Asians because I have traveled extensively throughout Asia, not just China, Korea, and Hong Kong, etc. Americans don't understand that. It is, in our culture, face is not something of great importance, at least in that sense. 3
years ago, you were brave enough to fly C-47, and by the way, C-47 was a very old jet, so you ran a lot of risks in flying the sortie in peace times. However, you are remembered by the Chinese out of a deep gratitude. Tell us more about the story.
We wanted to bring a significant aircraft to the museum. What few people realize is the C-47 was more important to China's survival than the P-40s and the bombers, because without the C-47 to bring the supplies in, the fuel, the bombs, the oxygen for the fighters and the bombers, they would have been just ground targets for the Japanese. So very important. Flying the Hump was the most dangerous flying in the world. There were more Hump pilots killed than bomber and fighter pilots combined. And that's an astounding number. So we wanted to recreate that flight because we wanted to shine a light on that history. And by doing so, we had hoped it would receive widespread publication. And it did get some publication. It turned out that recreating that flight was probably almost as hard as when they originally flew across the Hump. What was supposed to be an 8-day trip took 96 days because of mechanical problems. It also took the extreme effort of the Chinese Consul General in Surabaya. It took the help of the Chinese with Casey Ma and the Friendship Association to get clearances into Chinese airspace, coordinating with the Chinese authorities that handle that. So it was a joint effort again. And as this 96 days unfolded, it came across to me in two manners. One, every time I got discouraged, I thought how those Hump pilots faced adversity and went on, persevered. I also was reflected on the fact that in order for us to complete that flight, it took the help of the Chinese again. Without their help, we would not have succeeded.
Sadly, the survivors were outnumbered by those who were killed in the missions. Tell us more about the story. Why so many, over 1,500 were killed, or someone will put the figure to almost 6,000
I believe you're referring to 1,500, actually almost 1,600. Those were Hump pilots that were killed, flying the Hump. And there were many reasons for that. First of all, the aircraft were not capable of clearing terrain, so they had to fly through the passes rather than over the mountains. Weather reporting was sparse back then. Navigation systems were very poor, and the aircraft were many times overloaded. So all of these factors contributed to a very high accident rate, plus the fact that they had to fly through the passes, let the Japanese fighters know right where to look for them to shoot them down. And these cargo planes were unarmed. Now, the flying taggers in the fighter aircraft and the Chinese fighter pilots helped to protect these airplanes. But that was almost an impossible task. So that's the reason for that high mortality rate. The other portion of that question, I think, that needs emphasized is if you were a fighter pilot or a transport pilot, and you were shot down or went down over enemy territory, and the Chinese picked you up, you had a 95% chance of getting back to your base alive. That's almost a guarantee. Now, you have to understand that the Japanese offered rewards for these pilots. The Japanese would come into villages and they would torture and maim and kill people trying to find out where these pilots were, and yet the Chinese protected them and took them back to their base. That kind of help was invaluable. I would think, and I was not a fighter pilot in World War II, but I would think a fighter pilot taking off to do battle would be comforted by the fact that he knows if he goes down, he's going to have people to help, friends to help. In fact, we have asked and have a statue placed in the museum which shows a flying tagger on a stretcher being borne by villagers, protected by Chinese military. And on that statue we have inscribed, "Safe in the hands of friends."
Safe in the hands of friends.
Safe.
This is of immortal value. Thank you for sharing with us your feeling towards the inscription. That's something that our children and children's children must keep in mind to protect the friendship.
Absolutely.
Despite the adversity of the current circumstances.
We will always have differences, but we should always have those differences as friends.
Common memories about the war would definitely unite peoples from the United States and China. Tell me why a British author wrote a book, China, a Forgotten Ally in the Second World War. What do you think of the ignorance Chinese, their huge sacrifice, have not been covered sufficiently by media in the West or by academics in the West?
Oh, I think there's a lot of reasons for that, but I think probably the major reason is there were no major battles fought on Chinese soil. There were many, many battles. The Chinese suffered immensely under the Japanese, but no major battles, nothing like D-Day at Normandy. At the end of World War II, the world was tired of war. They wanted to forget. They wanted to put it behind them. So they did. And that stuffed the history down. It has only been, I believe it was, the author's name was Chang that wrote the history of the Nanking Massacre. She didn't do that until the 70s, and that book became well known in our country and brought the story forward. But there are many stories very similar to that.
But you know the author, the woman, committed suicide out of depression.
Yes, yes, she did. She was very depressed by the history that she looked at. Anybody that reads about that massacre, anybody that sees the pictures from that massacre can't help but be depressed. One of the things, as I said, I have read maybe 200 books, and many of those talk about the atrocities committed by the Japanese against the Chinese and the Asians. I shouldn't say just Chinese, it was Asian as a whole. And it angers me to this day. 70 years later, it angers me that anybody could be treated that way or would treat anyone that way. But again, it's the World War II, they just wanted to forget, and they did. That's why I think it's important, it's very important to record the history, have it available for people to look at in the future. When I was flying to Asia in 1995, the Japanese had just published a textbook for their high school students that painted the Japanese Army of World War II as an army of liberation. All of the Asian nations were up in arms about it. The Japanese finally pulled the textbook from their school because of that. But the point is, they were trying to revise history. And we need the history recorded so that can't happen.
You know what the Chinese politicians say on and off these years about the war? They say, we could forgive, but we should never ever forget. And Premier Wen Jiabao said, a review of the history doesn't mean we want to sustain hate. It does mean we have to remember the atrocities that the aggressors inflicted on the Chinese.
Yes, and I would agree fully with that.
Thank you, Larry. I appreciate it.
It is
Thank you
pleasure.
so much.
Thank you for having me.
Why you decided to set up this historical organization?
They almost know nothing about the Flying Tiger.
Was it a dangerous mission?
We know that's the hardest transporting route in the military in the world.
So did you make any efforts to ask for help from Japan?
I had sent them. If you don't remember recording the history, you will not have a very bright future.
Welcome back. In the second half of this program, we are happy to be joined by Mr. Keishi Ma, Vice President of the Flying Tigers Historical Organization. Look, we'd like to know more about why you decided to set up this historical organization on Flying Tigers, which is, of course, a very important story for the younger generation to remember the Second World War, the huge sacrifice our American allies made.
Well, this is a long story. During the 80s, after I graduated from Foreign Languages Institute from Xi'an, and I to be working for the China International Travel Service. That time, I took a lot of group when the country just opened. So the group of Flying Tiger crowd into China. They want to see where they once lived and fight with the Chinese people. I do got a lot of chance to go with them. So the largest group I got is around 36 people, and in '82. And every day I heard their heroic stories every day. Everyone has different. So I got so touched and so moved.
Each member of the delegation had their own interesting stories about the war, about the Flying Tigers. And you were impressed?
Yeah, very impressed.
So what did you decide to do next?
Yeah, after I got to that's 1993, and I decided to let this story comes back alive, because when I working in China, and also among the young people and also the people under 40s, they almost know nothing about the Flying Tiger. In America, American youth, American people, the same thing. So I feel the heartbroken. So if things goes like this part of history will be finished, and no one will remember. So that will be the regrets for this part of history. So then I decided I went to do something with my friends. Larry Zhou, which is my old friend for 20 years, and JT, the chairman, I later know of him on the tour, and we have the same voice. So decided to set up organization to protect this part of history is critical. First thing we did is we're planning a museum. So before this is not easy. After 10 years, and this museum was opening. Right after opening, we feel not that's enough. We want to do more work. Project the C-47 re-flying Hump.
Was it a dangerous mission?
Very dangerous mission. I just tell you, at the beginning they tell me, hey, KC, possible to do this? The answer first to me, I said, no. Why? Because we know nothing. We know that's the hardest transporting routing in military in the world. With that 600 aircraft across there. Right now, We used a 74-years-old aircraft, and we couldn't find a pilot. So find a pilot is another subject. This is not easy. So later on, anyway, we found out, introduced by the friends, and we found from internet, we found 3 from Australia and 2 from America. So we start our project in 2014 until 2017 March. So this part, I tell you, I really appreciated the pilot who take the risk of life and take 97 days across 6 countries, you know, overcome all the difficulties, especially some of them is heartbreaking. So Larry just saying one thing. During the flight on the Himalaya one day, that the day we thought the weather's good, and there's no navigation, nothing. It's only things judged by eye. Fly over the Himalaya. And I was in Kunming with the provincial leaders. Suddenly, half an hour, I lost signal. My heart has dead. I don't know what to do. I hold apple. I'm going to eat. When I heard this, I forgot it. So I just running back and forth. I said, what am I going to do for next? So you understand what my feeling. Suddenly, half an hour later, the signal come back. I threw the apples out the ceiling without notice. Everybody staring at me. What are you doing there? You know, like that. You can see. But actually, what our mission is impossible. We did possible. We fly from 2016, supposed a 3 days tour. We fly 97 days on November 19th, 2000. We finish.
It sounds like a mission impossible, yet you got it done. Thank you for sharing with us this very interesting story, inspiring story about the spirit of old flying tigers. Was it difficult to raise funds to construct the museum?
Oh, okay. First of all, we should let the people, because raise funds were among the Americans in the United States. Because of lack knowledge of flying tiger among the people. First, we have to do a large number of education and seminars, let them know what these crazy guides, they take us, you know, as a crazy guide, you know. And we tell them, then brought them into interest and to our circle. And then more and more people came to support us. We use internet, Facebook, seminars all over the United States. Of course, at the same time, and among overseas China as well. And for this, we say it's not a small money. But with the help of the people, and we made this. We got first batch of money, 175, from the famous, very well-known overseas Chinese, Florence Fong, with the 175. They support to purchase the airplane. Another 500, and all we donated from the Americans. That's altogether so close to $700,000 to complete the mission. Even that, all our pilots, they do their volunteer work. They take care, they dedicate themselves, sacrifice, take the risk of dive without any return, no pay.
Casey, what you do now is important for the past, but more important for the future. Writing history, a review of history, I'm afraid, is a collective job to be done by Americans, Chinese, and the Japanese, and as well as other Asians in this region. So did you make any efforts to ask for help from Japan, where you would also have many kind of volunteers to help collect things and items, or to bring people together to review history from the Japanese perspective. It could also be an important part of the job you're doing.
Okay, we're thinking about it. We think of 3 other jobs. One is trying to get more resources, build more stories from the flying tiger families and relatives. And also, we would like to find more, people in Japan who know this part of history, and they were patriotic. They were, thinking what we are doing is good. But we are working, not a big progress. It's not easy, because when I do something, for one time, the Japanese minister visit before, 3 days before they visit in San Francisco, I was called by the Consul General. They called me and to go and to have tea with them. See, their opinion is I cannot accept it. They were thinking, don't always telling the history back. Let's focus on the future, because future is what we want. But I have sent them, if you don't remember recording the history, you will not have a bright future. So we have a lot of different things. They were trying to tell people doing it this way. This we feel another, difficulties, but we are determined to do something.
Let's take a quick look at the current U.S.-China relationship. Remember history, as you said wisely, would help us navigate a healthy course in the future. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the consequential relationship between Washington and Beijing?
Certainly it does, because, look at the past 40 years. China-Sino relationships goes like a roller coaster, up, and down. But every time after the storm, we come to a new stage. So the same thing, difference is natural, but common ground is everybody was recognized. So the flying tiger, we were going to put them in an important role, because sometimes I saw even in the Rose Garden or in the great people, hall of people, and sometimes when they have stay silent, there's nothing they can going on, and then they found the common ground is a flying tiger. So I think we would like to carry the spirit of the flying tiger, so that's mutual respect, sacrifice, and dedication, and of course mutual understanding, and found the common ground, and the 2 great nations will have further, will go on, will have a further bright future. I was very confident with that.
I thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
being with us.
Thank you.